Hey guys, welcome to A Push with Lennox. Today we're going to talk about the Spanish colonial system. Now previously we've covered topics like the Native Americans and how they established civilizations throughout North and South America. And then we did a presentation on the motivating factors behind European exploration, specifically the Spanish. And what we're going to look at today is what happened when they got here, how the Spanish interacted with the Native Americans. Now, I don't know if you realize this, but the Spanish actually established the very first permanent settlement in North America in 1565 in St. Augustine. This is about roughly 40 years before the English get here and establish their permanent settlement of Jamestown. So they're well ahead of the English, and in fact, they're well ahead of all other colonizing empires at this point. When they first came over, I don't know if you remember, but Columbus originally set sail and landed at Hispaniola. And Hispaniola was where his first mission went. And what's going to happen is we're going to see these islands in the Caribbean kind of become home base for Spanish exploration. We're going to see the Spanish launch other explorations from this area. We're going to see them launch their military from this region. We're also going to see how these islands here, specifically like Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, they become the center of New Spain in the Western Hemisphere. Now, when we talk about some of the other explorations that took place, you might want to be familiar with Ponce de Leon, who in the early 1500s is going to explore modern-day Florida. Hernando de Soto actually explored the Mississippi River region. And then, of course, there's Francisco Coronado, who in the 1540s is going to search throughout Southwest America in what we consider modern-day New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma. And I believe he was searching for the cities of gold. I don't think he found them, but if you know anything, let me know. I'm interested. But I want to talk more, though, about the interaction between the Native Americans and the Spanish, because quite honestly, that's got to be the biggest question, is how are these two civilizations going to come together? And remember, we have hundreds of different tribes, so each one's going to be a little different. So in the matchup of Native Americans versus God, glory, and gold, I think you kind of know where this one's going. But let's see how we got there. The Spanish used several systems to establish their colonies, several tools, if you will. And one of those tools was a conquistador. Now, a conquistador was similar to like a knight or a soldier, but they were also explorers in their own right. And they would come out on behalf of the Spanish crown, and they would go into different lands and basically claim those lands and then try to settle and colonize those lands. It wasn't just here in North America that conquistadors were working. Spain sent them into South America. They sent them into Africa and other places of the world, all with the same idea, to go in, gain control, and colonize on behalf of the Spanish crown. Now, these conquistadors were given economic and political control over any territory that they oversaw. Two of the famous ones that you probably should be familiar with is Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. Now, Cortés is credited with destroying the Aztec Empire. Just as a reminder, the Aztecs were centered in central Mexico, and Hernán Cortés was able to go in, and this vast civilization that had been created basically brought them to their knees. And a lot of it was because of the Columbian Exchange. We talked about that in the last video, and one of the key components of the Columbian Exchange was germs and disease. The Aztecs were weakened tremendously by disease by the time Cortés got here. So it really wasn't too difficult a task for him to overtake them. The other thing he did was he used other tribes, the natural enemies of the Aztecs, to do his fighting for him. Now, he took over the Aztecs, and then he's going to start that northward migration of Spanish into North America. Francisco Pizarro is credited with destroying the Incas down in South America. While this doesn't have a huge bearing on American history, it shows a pattern. It shows the way or the process that the Spanish used in order to gain control of different territories. Now, once control was established, or maybe not completely established, but they had a pretty good hold on a territory, the Spanish would then implement what's known as the mission system. Missions were built throughout Spanish territory, and these missions would be used to interact with the Native Americans. One of the very first missions was built in San Antonio, my town, in 1718. But they just weren't in Texas. They were in New Mexico. They were in Arizona, and they went up into California. In fact, by 1769, you had Spanish missions all the way north as far as San Diego, which I know in today's geography doesn't sound that far north, but that was quite an advancement that the Spanish had made of territory in North America by that time. Now, the goals, once the mission system was established, was to teach the Native Americans Spanish and convert them to Christianity. Once that was completed, once the Native Americans spoke the language and worshiped the same way, they were considered subjects of the Spanish crown. And good, loyal subjects always paid taxes. You gotta love taxes. And you can kind of tie that to the gold part of God, glory, and gold. Spain was in this for the money. I mean, the conversion is important, the glory is important, but let's face it, the money is what drove it. And so these were the goals of the mission systems as they were being established. If you look at this map here, like I said, I don't think you might not realize the extent of territory that the Spanish controlled in North America. Now, this is by 1810. This is, notice the United States of America is already in play at this point. And actually, there's a typo on this because this can't be 1810 because Louisiana was part of the United States by 1803. So I apologize for this mistake, but we're just going to keep rolling because Spain did control Louisiana for a while. But you get an idea of what New Spain looked like in the 1700s. So I'm going to use that year. Now, when you think about the mission system, I often think about this quote by Robert Burns, that the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. We can have the best plans that we think will be the best for everybody, but once you have men get involved, it just can get ugly, and that's exactly what happened in New Spain. Let me introduce you to the encomienda system. The encomienda system was supposed to be a plan that would benefit both the Spanish settlers and the Native Americans. And this plan just didn't work out the way it was supposed to. Now, initially, the way it was supposed to work is land that was claimed by Spain would be shared with the Native Americans. The Spanish settlers would come in, take control of the land, and being controllers of the land, they would provide protection for the Native Americans from rival tribes and stuff like that. They would take care of them. They would, Christianize them. They would almost take kind of like a fatherly role with the Native Americans. In exchange, the Native Americans would help them work the land. They could work a portion of their time on Spanish land to help establish it. That's the plan. Now let's look at the reality. The reality was that Spanish settlers didn't have them work part-time. They forced them into long hours of labor in very harsh conditions. They didn't pay them. They didn't protect them. And they typically just started taking more and more land from them. As a result of this, the Indians are going to start dying out. We already know that they're weakened by disease. Now you put them in this harsh labor, slave-like system, and that's going to make it even worse. So they're going to die from disease. They're going to die from their working and living conditions, and the numbers of Native Americans are drastically going to drop. Like I said in previous presentations, European conquest of the Americas is going to result in almost 95% of loss of life for the Native American tribes. This also created a caste system of society. And if you look at the Spanish society in New Spain, the peninsulares are at the top of the food chain. These are men who were born in Spain and then came over to New Spain. Right below them is the Creoles. Now, the Creoles were actually born in New Spain, but they had Spanish-born parents. I think of these guys as more of the second generation of New Spain. Right in the middle, we have the mestizos, and this is a term I really want you to know, because the mestizos is a brand new race of people. This is a group of people who come from both Spanish and Native American blood. And they're going to be, that's going to become predominantly the population of the southwestern part of North America. Right below them are the Native Americans. Now, I want to point out the Native Americans are not on the bottom of this food chain or this social structure. That's going to be those who are enslaved. And those who were enslaved, not necessarily under the encomienda system, but slavery still existed with African Americans. That's right. The Spanish, before the English, brought African Americans to North America, about 500,000 of them. And the way it would work was for every African that came over to New Spain as a slave, a tax would be paid to the Spanish crown. So they encouraged this is kind of like the beginning of what we'll talk about later, the triangular trade of Africans coming from Africa into North America. This is kind of the beginning of it here. Now, not everyone saw this as a good thing. There were people who spoke out, especially against the encomienda system. And one of those people were Bartolome de las Casas. Now, de las Casas actually came to New Spain as a colonist, and he actually participated in the encomienda system. He actually pushed the idea of using African slaves, saying that they'll last longer and they'll give you a better a better workload with them. But what's going to happen is De las Casas, while he's here, he's actually going to come to Jesus. And he's going to join the Catholic Church and become a Dominican priest. And when that happens, he changes his viewpoint. He kind of matures and says, what we're doing here is not right. And he's going to start writing letters to Spanish government officials, proclaiming that the encomienda system was too much. It had to be undone, that the conquistadors had too much power. And through his efforts and those of others, the encomienda system is going to be outlawed in New Spain. African slaves still exist, though, and they're not outlawed. I want to talk about a couple of interactions between the Native Americans and the Spanish. Honestly, when you go into the New Mexico region, Arizona with the Pueblos, normally the Spanish had a pretty good relationship, a good working relationship with them. That's going to change with Juan de Onate. Onate is going to be a conquistador who was given the authority to colonize the Santa Fe area. And when he goes in there, he starts to work with, and he works with the Acoma, and the Acoma were part of the Pueblo nation. And at some point, he decides he wants more land. So he is going to send his nephew to an Acoma city to scope it out, basically. When they get there, his nephew, I'm stumbling over my words, his nephew is basically going to demand that the Acoma feed his troops. And they're going to refuse. They're going to no, we're not going to feed you. And at that point, his nephew is going to attack the Acomas, and a battle is going to occur. In that battle, I think 11, 12 Spanish soldiers are going to be killed. This ticks off Onate, and he is going to call for retribution. He's not going to send his nephew back. This time he's going to send his uncle back. His uncle's name was Vicente, let me look it up, Vicente de Salvador. Vicente de Salvador is going to go in, and they are actually going to attack the Acoma. This is a big civilization. There were about 6,000 Acoma living in this area. Of those 6,000, about a third of them were warriors, but they didn't have the weaponry to match what the Spanish had. And throughout several days of battle, we're going to see about 800 Acoma Native Americans killed. Of those 800, 300 were women and children. Now, Onate wasn't done. He wanted justice for those 11, 12 Spanish who had been killed in that earlier battle. So he's going to continue to punish the Acoma. After the battle, he is going to order that all men over the age of 25 are going to serve 20 years slave labor and have their right foot cut off. That's right. They're going to cut off their right foot. Now, in reality, only about 34 men had their foot amputated, but really, 34 men had their foot amputated. On top of that, he wasn't done. He said all Acoma Indians between the age of 12 and 25, men and women, are going to be forced into slave labor for about 20 years. This was over the top. Word got back to Spain, to King James. He's like, no. Now, this is, I think this is roughly around the same time that de las Casas might be right in his letter. Don't quote me on that part. But King James looks at what's going on with Onate, and he calls him back. He said, you got to come back to Spain. I'm not going to let you do this over there. And so Onate is going to go back to Spain. Now, he's not going to be punished. He lives out the rest of his days in Spain, which how bad could that be? But this sets a tone between the Pueblo nation and the Spanish. And that's going to come to a head in 1680 with what we refer to as the Pueblo Revolt. It's also known as Pope's Revolt. I mentioned that the Spanish and the Pueblo had generally gotten along. While they were attempting to Christianize them, they often let the Native Americans still practice their own religious ceremonies. Well, what's going to happen in about 1670, maybe 1675, right around there? A Franciscan priest is going to come into the territory. He's like, we ain't doing that anymore. We're here to Christianize them, which means no more of their religious practices. And he sends soldiers to all these homes to basically confiscate all the religious artifacts of the Pueblo Indians. On top of that, all this stuff is going on. On top of that, you have the Pueblos who are working with the Spanish, and the Spanish are supposed to be protecting them. Well, they're in this huge drought. And a neighboring tribe, the Apache, are going to start attacking the Pueblo, trying to get supplies and stuff. And the Pueblo aren't able to defend themselves, so they look to the Spanish and say, defend us. And the Spanish don't do that. Well, you're going to see some of the medicine men or the priests of the Pueblo nation start going back to their religious practices. And when that's happened, that same Franciscan priest is going to arrest them. One of those medicine men / religious leaders is Pope. Pope is going to sit in jail for about 4 to 5 years. And during that time, he's thinking and he's coming up with a plan. When he gets out, he has a plan in place for all the Pueblo nation, the Acoma Indians, the Tico Indians, I think the Taka, I'm not sure, I'm messing up some of these tribe names. He wants to coordinate all of them for an all-out attack against the Spanish. And he communicated this plan with all these different tribes and said, if we all fight together, we can win. And the way he coordinates the attack is he's going to send runners to each tribe. And those runners are taking a rope with them. You can see one in the hand of Pope right there. And that rope had knots tied in it. And the chiefs of each of the tribes were instructed, untie one knot each morning. When there are no more knots, that is the day we're going to attack. It was ingenious. However, unfortunately, the Spanish found out about it. They stopped one of the knot runners, and they tortured him until he told them what was happening. So they knew the attack was going to happen and what day it was going to happen. Pope changes the plan. When that happens, he says, we got to move it up a day. And even though not all of the tribes got word of the change of plans, enough of them did, where the Pueblo attacked the Spanish, attacked Spanish settlers as well, and drove them out of the New Mexico region. And they're not going to be able to return for years. Now, this is very important to understand what happened because we're going to see this several times throughout American history. Time periods where Native Americans from different tribes come together to go against white settlers, to go against expansion. And there's always a positive outcome when they do that. The problem the natives had was because there's so many different cultures, those alliances were only temporary. And once those alliances fell apart and the natives went back to their own cultures and their own, driving desires for what they needed, settlers were able to come back in quite easily. And the same thing happened with the Spanish. Years later, the Spanish and their settlers are able to come back into the New Mexico region. However, they're going to come back in with a little bit different attitude. They're going to allow the worship to take place. They're going to allow the natives to keep some of their customs because they didn't want to see another revolt like what happened with Pope and the Pueblo Revolt. This brings me to a point that I want to share with you. I got this from Tom Ritchie. I didn't get it. I stole it from him. And when we look at the relationship between Europeans and the Native Americans, generally they fall into 3 different categories. And these categories are coming from General Patton. General Patton was a great American general. And he once said, lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. And that's kind of how a lot of these European settlers, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English for that matter, all looked at the Native Americans. The relationship between Europeans and Native Americans all fell into these three categories: lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. With the Spanish, their motivation was follow me. Their goal was to get the Native Americans to follow them. Follow me into Christianity. Follow me into the Encomienda system. Follow me into new Spanish civilizations. That was what the Spanish are going to do. So if you're ever asked to compare the three, remember, the Spanish wanted the Native Americans to follow me. You do what I tell you, and as long as you're doing what I'm telling you, things are going to be good. Okay? All right, so that's going to wrap up our discussion on the Spanish colonial system, and that'll lead us into the French and Dutch in our next discussion. And then after that, we're moving on to the English, and we're going full steam ahead. But before we leave here, there's no doubt about it. The introduction of European exploration had a decimating effect on Native Americans. Whether you look at the Columbian Exchange or things like the Acoma Massacre or the Encomienda system, with regards to the Spanish, everything that they did once they came in basically led to the end of the lives of millions of Native Americans. And it's not going to end with the Spanish. We're going to see the same thing happen with the French, and we're going to see the same thing happen with the English. But that's what's coming up. Hope you guys learned something today. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.